because while it's not certain which one it would be, we should do something good in Barcelona, in Catalonia, because I think Catalonia has had a big role, significant role in bringing about this treaty, and so I'd like to invite you all to celebrate that day of entry into force, which other campaigners around the world will also be celebrating. Okay, so that's a very short history of the process and where we are now. One other element that's important, I think, before I give a little bit of analysis of the two provisions I want to talk about. The intellectual framework behind the prohibition of cluster munitions is a bit different from the intellectual framework behind other weapons prohibitions. So traditionally, in international humanitarian law, to prohibit a weapon, you had to be able to say one of two things. Firstly, that by its nature, the weapon caused superfluous injury to combatants. So this is like, for example, weapons that leave undetectable fragments in the human body. Those weapons are seen to cause too much suffering to combatants. So they're prohibited. The other reason you can prohibit a weapon under international humanitarian law is that the weapon by its nature is always indiscriminate. So an example of this is the weapons that were developed to carry flames, fireballs in hot air balloons all over the wind. These are always indiscriminate. There's no way you can control them. Chemical weapons, also always indiscriminate. Cluster bombs don't fall into either of those categories. They're not always indiscriminate. If you're controlling their use very carefully in an area where you're absolutely certain there's no civilians, then it's hard to say they are by nature indiscriminate. They don't cause a particularly difficult type of injury as opposed to other explosive weapons. So they don't cause superfluous injury. But we succeeded in prohibiting them. And the basis for this was a kind of precautionary approach. We said, let's look at the harm that these weapons have caused every time they've been used. And let's consider the balance of humanitarian protection. And once this was considered, people just decided the weapons caused too much humanitarian harm. And this, I think, is very interesting because it sets a precedent that for future weapons prohibitions, you don't need to show that it's either causing superfluous injury or by nature always indiscriminate. You can make a judgment that it causes too much harm, therefore, on the basis of precaution, it should be prohibited. It's very important. Okay. I want to talk the two provisions in the Convention that are different from, there are other provisions that are different, but the two most interesting from my perspective. You may wish to talk about others, and I'm happy to afterwards. But the two I want to talk about first of all are the definition of a cluster munition and the provision on victim assistance. First of all, and these, I think it's fair to say, are the two provisions in the treaty on which civil society, and perhaps also governments, spent most of their time during the negotiations. The other area is, of course, interoperability. NGOs, we didn't spend all that much time on that question. Maybe that was a mistake because it's the weakest provision in the Convention. And some governments spend a lot of time, but the two areas, I think, where there was the most work are definition and victim assistance. Okay, definition. In my view, the definition of a cluster munition offers a huge opportunity for civil society and governments to interpret the Convention beyond its own provisions and to influence international law and practice of states. It also opens up a very interesting area of analysis about all weapons, all explosive weapons that have an impact during attacks and after attacks. It's worth just considering for a moment that cluster bombs are actually very similar to other types of explosive weapons, like artillery, like rockets, like other unitary bombs. We spent a lot of time as the campaign trying to say that cluster bombs were very different from other types of weapons, and that was why they needed to be banned. And this is true, they do have special properties. They're particularly problematic. They're particularly problematic because of their area effect, and they're particularly problematic because of the unexploded bombs that they leave. But these two problems, area effect and unexploded bombs, they are common to all explosive weapons. If you're using artillery, you're going to have those two problems. So what makes cluster bombs special enough to be prohibited, is the acuteness, the level, the scale of these problems, but not the problems themselves. So this is very interesting, and it allows us to say that if you've prohibited this weapon because of these two problems that are actually common to all explosive weapons, then what does that say about these other explosive weapons that we're using? Normal artillery, normal unitary bombs, normal rockets. And I think the reason we're able to start to look at these other explosive weapons is because of the structure of the definition. And the definition explicitly recognizes these two problems of indiscriminate area effect and unexploded ordnance. And it does so in the paragraph 2C of Article 2. And this paragraph 2C was, very, very controversial. And many people see it as an exception. They see it as something that rich countries, in particular Germany, carved out for themselves so that they could keep their high-tech weapons.